And so we would have to say, nope, we want to know what the state of the art is. We want the evidence, and we will develop the recommendations.
If there is a substantial challenge presented to how that knowledge is assessed and or communicated, it may in fact reflect some flaws in the formal advisory process.
If we take this extreme view that any contact or any strategic decision of how you communicate is already a breach of integrity, we really run the risk of a lot of precious knowledge being lost.
Prime Minister, we think there'll be a minimum of at least so many people likely to be affected and a maximum of so many. We don't know what it will be in the middle. Prime Ministers can work to that. You don't need to go in there and say, Prime Minister, we think that next week there'll be 357 people admitted to hospital.
And SCAR has become a lot more, I think, engaged in the science policy interface, not giving recommendations per se, but definitely trying to make a real effort in ensuring that the science that they're delivering is able to be utilised in decision making.
But what this crisis has taught us is that basic discovery, pointy-headed scientists like me have had to get out into the real world, in this case the medical world, and we have forged all sorts of links to those involved in medical practice.
Humanities needs to get away from this typical, mode of complaining. Why aren't we being paid attention to? Why aren't we actually, since we are so good in transmitting the instruments of discrimination?
Carl Hennigan, who's the director of the University of Oxford Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine, and he wrote a piece in the Spectator about masks, raising some questions about their efficiency. And this piece then got shared on Facebook, where it got classified as misinformation.
Science diplomacy has always been very supply-side driven. You have the science ministries, the science advisors, the science institutions, all talking about the great good of science and how we can help the diplomats and so on. But there's still a lack on the demand side. Actually, diplomats approaching the scientists and demanding solutions.
So sometimes you see that people say, well, that's our cultural identity, and that's all. There's no ethical objection to that. And I don't think so. I think ethics has to take serious what culture says about the values of people and their way of living, but there should nevertheless be the possibility to ask whether these cultural habits align to human rights.
The other extreme is like the US. And so in a culture where it's about me, myself, and I mean, you can't really have collective action where populations are saying, even wearing a mask, which you would argue would be a non-starter, that becomes then an infringement of your personal me, myself, and I philosophy.
People say in all kinds of contexts that science is a new religion, blah, blah. I never quite buy it. But then what you've just said puts me in mind of these medieval cathedrals where the person who designed it or the person who commissioned and paid for it knew full well it would take 100 years to build and they would never see it completed, but they did it anyway.
This is the modern times cathedral,
In the US, we have looked at public trust in scientists over time, since before the outbreak to after it. And there we saw public trust in scientists go up, but it turns out that upward trend only occurs among Democrats and has stayed about the same among Republicans.
They are completely free to give their advice and express their opinions to politicians, but actually there is a responsibility that goes with the role to not then dissent from that publicly.
they more see the science as like icing on the cake. That if they can put in some cool little science Easter eggs or come up with some really wacky ideas that are rooted in science, they really like that.
Kind of got to a stage with it all where it's embarrassing to say, by the way, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yes.